Hello again. So here we are. We are in chapter 6 of this lovely book. And also, just to show off some awesome merch, not my own, but this is from Belief Mel. Belief in Fatherhood is his YouTube channel. I highly recommend watching it. Check him out on Instagram. But he and his family have been having little sales over the past few months. Our second one was just a couple days ago. This is from their first one, and it's a sweatshirt that says "Love Thy Neighbor," and then has some awesome lyrics on the back. So check them out when you have a chance. I'll post it in the show notes as well. So chapter 6 is about politics and race. Right? So this is something that people don't really, well, I shouldn't say people. I should say some people really want to avoid the topic of race. They want to avoid the topic of politics too, but then especially we start talking about race, and now it becomes even more uncomfortable. But let's just start with the main idea of this chapter. First of all, the main idea is that racial reconciliation requires work and time, and it begins and ends with the gospel. Also included in that main idea is that race and politics go together. You can't do politics without addressing race, without addressing racial divides. All that's just deeply, deeply ingrained, particularly in American politics and society and history. So they're intertwined, and though some of us may wish that we could ignore the race question altogether, or we focus on pointing out how much better things are now than they were back in the 1960s. This isn't like the civil rights movement. There's no segregation. There's no colored bathrooms and whatnot. There's not slavery anymore, you guys. Calm down. No. So there is still, if you have been living under a rock in this insane year, then maybe you missed it. But no, racial tensions are still very, very much alive, and they need to be addressed. And it needs to start in the church. It needs to start with believers. And so this chapter digs into that. So if we're addressing the main idea of this book, which is that Christians, how can we be called to faithful engagement, faithful civic engagement in the political arena as believers? One of those areas that we need to address is race. And something that we absolutely must do as Christians is we got to call out racism. We can't just let it lie. We can't just ignore it. And we have to, not just the blatant racism of, someone dropping an N-word or someone blatantly not allowing someone of color to come in to their store or whatever. Like there's the obvious explicit racism, but so much deeper and so much more, I think, significant for us to point out and to call out is the implicit racism within our own thoughts, within our history, within the church, all of that. No one wants to sit around and think that they're a racist. Nobody wants to talk about that. No one wants to think about that. But we have to address in our hearts if there's something in there that is helping to keep this separation, particularly, again, in the church. It's got to start in the church, and it's got to start in us, in our connections with one another. So we have to call it racism. We have to be careful not to get too caught up in the passion of calling out racism, of calling out injustice in general. Passion should drive us forward, absolutely. But as my pastor has said many times, the heart is a terrible taskmaster, but a wonderful servant. So we don't follow our hearts, we don't follow our anger, we don't follow our passion. We allow that to drive us forward, maybe, and to give us that kick in the pants that we need. But we then have to wrangle that. We have to lead that passion into somewhere or something that's going to be proactive, that's going to make change. And we use the Holy Spirit. We are empowered by the Holy Spirit and the gospel to bring forth that change and advance the kingdom. So all that to say, if we don't call out racism, someone else will. And those groups may not carry the gospel with them. They may not believe. They may be anti-Christianity. They may be anti-faith altogether, and it's not going to work. There may be band-aid solutions. There may be things that seem good or seem to work, but in the long term, it's not going to work without the gospel. And as believers, if we actually believe that the gospel is literally the cure to everything, is literally what everybody needs, in order to be reconciled to God and to each other, then we've got to bring that everywhere we go, and that is including in the fight against racism. But again, if we don't call it out, other groups will. Also, we have to be wary of any other groups that are fighting against racism when we join up with a movement or a group. And this kind of goes back to a previous chapter talking about, partnerships and allyships and all of that. Be wary of the groups that you join. Avoid the mob mentality. And so in the book, on page 102, it goes into a little bit more of what that looks like to, be cautious and to avoid the mob sort of crowd. And you want to look for solid, proactive goals. We want to avoid performative justice, and we saw a lot of that this year. There is something, I think, beautiful and powerful in that it raises awareness and it brings unity, but it tends to be just a temporary thing. And it also tends to, I'll just speak for myself, it can feel like, hey, I checked off my anti-racist box today. I posted the black square. I reposted this thing. I made that phone call. Those aren't bad things, but if that's all we're going to do, that's just pure surface level. And it can't be about us and about how good I look as someone who's not racist because I posted the thing, but it's got to be deeper than that. And so often, real justice, this real fight for justice, takes time, it takes work, and it takes, so much of it is done behind the scenes. So much of it is done underground. So much of it is done in classrooms and in Zoom calls and in dinners with friends, and it's done in the smaller connections too. The process is ultimately relational, not formulaic. So, the book even has like a 4-step framework for racial reconciliation that starts within the church. That's on pages 103 to 104, but it also states like this is a relational process. We're not going to have any kind of change or any kind of healing until we get that part. It's all relational. So my prayer, something that I've been wanting to pray into, and that I hope you join me in this. First and foremost, if you attend a church, pray for reconciliation within your community. Ask God to show you where the areas that maybe there's some division that you weren't even aware of. Division either that you may have caused or that you perceive coming from someone else or some other group. Ask God to shine a light on that. And then ask Him to show you what your part is in that. Ask for wisdom, grace, humility, so much humility for yourself and for others. And make connections. Again, this is relational. Politics is about people. Politics and race are intertwined. Reconciliation ultimately is relational. God gave us His Son so that we could be reconciled with the Father. That's relational. That is not a formulaic process. That is all about relationship. That's all about the heart, and that's all about connection. So, join me next time for chapter 7. We're going to talk about protest and advocacy, which I think is a good kind of tie-in to this one. And then if you do have any comments or questions, things that you would like me to talk about in the next Instagram Live, I'd be happy to do that. Go ahead and post comments either on YouTube or on Instagram or Facebook. Send me a text, a DM. I'd love to chat more about all of this. All right. Love you guys. Be blessed. Have a great week.